Joe, I think folks are really going to love our next segment.
Everybody likes to talk about the headlines and the hot topics of the day. That's right up our alley.
It is, and I also know that there are times when news reporters wish they had just a little bit more time to cover a story.
So this is your chance to learn a little bit more about the stories beyond just the sound bites.
So let's talk hot topics.
After months of preparation and planning, the Jackson County Budget Committee recently held public hearings to hear departmental presentations and review the recommended budget for 2018-19. Jackson County Administrator Danny Jordan begins this process with an overview to help set the foundation for the 6-member Budget Committee.
I do want to remind the Budget Committee, and I'm only going to go back to when I first started 12 years ago. We lost $24 million in O&C receipts. We closed the libraries. We cut our sheriff's budget, I think $4 million, and the libraries was $8 million. So that was 12 of 24 million we ended up having to cut. $4 million was a dedicated road fund, which we cut out of our road fund. The reason why I'm saying all this, at the time, we had enough to run the libraries in reserve for 1 year if we spent it all. So we had about 15 million in fund balance that we could access. So it's taken us a long time to build this fund balance and reserve that they talked about here. It actually will grow more in the recommended budget, and I'll explain a little bit of that to you when we get there. It's important to note that over the last 12 years also, we've built almost $200 million in capital projects without going to the taxpayers and asking them to fund it. Now, not all of that's out of the general fund. A lot of it was dedicated fund, especially in our airport. But I would say we're probably close to $100 million in building projects in 12 years that we paid cash for. So overall, I think this paints a pretty good picture for all the work we've done for a long time to pull and get us here. So first of all, I just want to kind of break this down into 4 categories. We have operating revenue. That's revenue that comes to us. It's constant, it's predictable. It's things like our tax base. So every year we can predict an amount of tax base that we're going to receive. We can plan that we're going to receive that, and we get it. We have non-operating revenue, and this is things like fund balance, reserves, and windfalls. It's stuff we can't depend on into the future. This is how we've grown our fund balance. We don't take non-operating revenue and put it into operations, because if we add staff with non-operating revenue, we don't have money next year to support it. We have dedicated, which is the biggest portion of our budget, so we get money from various resources, but we have to use it for a specific purpose. And then we have non-dedicated. So this is where really the Budget Committee makes most of their decisions about how we're going to spend revenue in our budget. In the county, the Budget Committee's primary priority has been public safety. And you'll see that 80% of our non-dedicated operating revenue that we have, where you get to make the decision, goes to public safety. So talking about this recommended budget, here's how it's coming to you recommended based on the budget targets that you set. This is the non-dedicated operating revenue, where you get to make the decisions, really how it's spent. 78% gets spent in the sheriff, DA, and community justice. Interestingly enough, internal services are pretty low charge, 4%. The assessor, 8%. I say this every year, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important to note that while public safety is our highest priority, without assessment, nothing gets done in government anywhere. So I would say assessment's probably the most necessary function that we do in order to make not only our government function, but every other taxing district or local government that receives revenue via property tax base. Just a couple points of information to keep in mind. You saw in last year's budget, we projected $60,408,000 as the general fund reserve. In this budget, it goes to almost 82.3 million. In other words, in a year, we grew a whole lot in our general fund reserve. So I do want to tell you a big portion of that is the turnaround in the economy. So we had budgeted funds for community development. They're going to actually generate a revenue back to the general fund. We have departments that have underspent their budgets. We did include in this budget, since we got it at last second before the budget was published for the budget message, we did include the reauthorization for O&C, so that got caught in this budget. We don't budget that as operating revenue because it can't be depended on. Every year we kind of get dragged along to see if we're going to get something or not. In this budget, general fund reserves are approximately $61.5 million. We do set aside roughly $10 million for cash flow purposes. This is something I always like to point out to the public too. Many local governments actually have to borrow money. They usually do it via revenue anticipation bonds to operate for the first part of the fiscal year until they actually collect taxes. Because we have a reserve, we're able to not go out and borrow money. That makes it less expensive for our taxpayers to operate our local government, because we're not paying interest on money we have to borrow to operate. And then we put $10 million in reserves and contingency. I do want to tell you that in past budgets, we've put the fund balance in an unappropriated ending fund balance, or a portion of it. This time I did not do that. This time I put it all in contingency or reserves, general fund reserves. The reason why I did that is we have a couple things on the horizon that could be big ticket items, and if we don't appropriate it, we can't use it at all. So $10 million in contingency can get spent by a Board of Commissioners board order, and that's less than 15% of our total budget. And reserves can get spent with a supplemental budget, which is also typically done with our Board of Commissioners. If we were going to have a big ticket item that was millions and millions of dollars, of course that would come back to probably the Budget Committee, not just the Board of Commissioners. I did that because we have a PERS potential ability to buy down our future unfunded actuarial liability in PERS, and also because we were talking about the possibility of a new jail. And we do expect to have to spend a significant portion of general fund reserves if we move forward with a jail project, simply just in property acquisition, conceptual design, site development. I had thrown a number out publicly, roughly of $100 million. I think that number's probably light. I actually think it probably would cost more than $100 million to build a new jail. So I want to talk a little bit about PERS. Everybody's talking about PERS. The legislature passed Senate Bill 1566. Basically, it allows a lump sum payment to PERS to create a side account that they can match 25%. So this basically buys down 25% of the county's obligation in PERS from a state fund, and buys us a side account that we can earn greater than the employer rate over the actuarial of 20 years. I put this up here because while we have $61 million in our rainy day fund, we're looking at using $22 million of that to potentially set up a side account for PERS. And that'll be a decision the board will ultimately make, but when you can get 25 cents on your dollar, it's something that's never been available before, and we did it when we could not get anything on our dollar except for the fact that we got a greater rate of return and bought down our rates. So definitely poised to be able to take advantage of this. Those are some of the reasons why I budgeted this a little bit differently than I have in the past, just to leave options for the Board of Commissioners and Budget Committee as we move through the next fiscal year. Our total reserves, contingency, and ending fund balance is approximately $146 million. So I told you our operating budget was about 191 of that $358 million. The rest is really savings. And this is really pretty remarkable. People will say that our budget went up several millions of dollars, and it did because we have to budget money we save. We have to tell the public we're growing our saving account, not just that we're growing our spending and our expenses. So the biggest growth in our budget this year is the fact that we put more money into savings than anything else. And I think that's pretty remarkable. I don't think you'll find very many local governments that are able to do that. Current year was projected at almost $126 million. So the general fund portion, as I said in the previous slide, almost $82.3 million, and then the dedicated funds is about $63.7 million. Interestingly enough, last year those were about equal. So we're growing the general fund balance and kind of holding steady on the dedicated funds fund balance. This is just to give you, I know it's small writing, but the idea here was to kind of give you a visual of where we're spending money in this budget. So if you look at personnel services, materials and supplies, and capital outlay, you'll see personnel services, materials and supplies went up. In personnel services, we did get hit with a pretty big increase, 4.2% payroll increase in PERS costs. That's probably the largest portion of cost in increase in personnel services. You'll see our capital outlay budget is going down. That's mostly because we finished some projects, or the majority of some projects out at the airport. Our debt service is going down. All of those trending in a pretty decent direction given the circumstances. Our interfund transfer is going down. Our contingency, which is savings, going up. and our ending fund balance, which is savings going up. And you can see the largest spread is on contingency and ending fund balances in terms of the entire budget.